Well, folks, the 2020 Democratic National Convention has come to a close. The absolute disastrous display put on by today's progressive liberals and the Hollywood elite left our country with a perfect illustration of just what Biden and the Dems could bring with a victory in November. Despite their best efforts, nothing but sheer embarrassment and shame is all that was left. For Joe Biden, he firmly believed that bringing out the Democratic big guns and historical heavy hitters would somehow catapult him into such a surmountable lead over Trump. However, the week-long media disaster left some Americans scratching their heads. Many more finally realizing that Biden has nothing more to offer than the empty promises of a failed 50-year liberal lame duck politician. This week, I'll break down just how bad the Democrats blew their chance to score a big win for Biden and the platform he paved for America that, if elected, will bring our nation to a socialistic end with the help of his newfound friends in AOC, Bernie Sanders, and the washed-up wannabe conservatives like John Kasich. I'm your host, Eric Wright, and this is the Closet Conservative Podcast. And what can only be described as a media disaster, and yet costing hundreds of millions in dollars in both security and planning, this week's Democratic National Convention was both weird to watch and as comfortable as a root canal. I'm almost embarrassed to say that I actually tuned in, but for political perspective, of course. But what about the other pathetic 5.7 million viewers that found nothing else better to do on a Monday night than to be spoon-fed socialism on day one of the convention? If you could stomach the first 45 minutes, it was clear that the platform that Biden and his gang were attempting to create for 2020 and for the Democrats was nothing more than divisiveness, race, and gender-baiting game of pandering-base politics. From the onset, Black Lives Matter and COVID-19 was shoved down the throats of viewers, and in traditional liberal fashion, the battle lines were clear. The white paint of racism was thrown all over Trump and the Republican Party. Within the first hour, the DNC couldn't help but to bring forward the family of George Floyd, who attempted to make the pitch again of a man who was a pillar of the black community in Minneapolis. Even more, the commentary and off-color music videos reminded me of something between a half-drunk backyard barbecue and a depressing funeral of an overdose victim. Now, I want to discuss some takeaways, though, from this week's event. First, Biden and the Democratic Party seem to have had regurgitated the leftovers from the party's primary stage. From Mayor Pete Buttigieg to Pocohantas herself, you could almost see the fear on the faces of those who once despised Sleepy Joe, the ones that attacked him on stage and in person and in interview about his lackluster record in politics over the last 50 years. But somehow now, after some coaching, some pocket patting, and about 24 antacids, the ones who couldn't cut it were projected on camera as saying, Biden will build a bigger, better America. Of course, no Democratic convention would be whole, would be right, without the presence of the blood-sucking Bill and Hillary Clinton, always wishing the limelight and continuing again to accuse Trump of somehow, some way of stealing Hillary's crown in 2016. The Clintons and the Democrats still not can believe that somehow Trump beat her in 2016. And in 4 years, they've gone through every single stage of grief, and now they are just PO'd. The liberals in this country are mad as hell, and they and the left-wing media pundits who miscued and miscalled the last election are not going to be wrong twice. Or are they? Folks, one thing is for certain. The Democratic Party and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris better hope for one thing. They better hope that they have a better voter turnout than viewership. For this year's DNC was watched by half compared to 2016. Now, of course, for those who actually did tune in, and if you by chance watched either CNN or MSNBC, you would believe that this week's convention was somehow magical, convincing that the entire world on the possible obliteration awaiting Trump in November. This weekend starts the Republican National Convention, where President Trump will lay out his vision of another 4 years of economic prosperity, global leadership, and preserving and protecting a nation that will not bow down or bend over to countries who wish to do us harm. Unlike the DNC, who purposefully left out the words "under God," During the Pledge of Allegiance, President Trump, live from the White House, will deliver a message of truth, honoring the great American story. Democrats failed in every facet during their convention. Why? Because they, in the party of failed policies and empty promises, have not and will not do anything different than what they have done for the last 50 years. From 100% of government dependency for minorities to creating an educational system that teaches our kids entitlement and empathy instead of hard work and accountability. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, with the political posturing of Nancy Pelosi, is the real party of divisiveness and the destruction of democracy of America. I want to thank you all for tuning in to today's episode. This week, I urge you all to sit down and watch the Republican convention and truly see the difference in how our nation's history, the good, the bad, the ugly, helped create the greatest country on earth. Our freedom, folks, is not free. No. It takes sacrifice from everyone. Our young nation has had its ups and it's had its downs. But I ask you, when the chips are down, when our nation is in crisis, who will you pick to lead the charge? A president who has spat in the face of members of the socialistic DC swamp, build a better America? Or a man who's had 50 years to make his mark, but instead he's made millions off the backs of hardworking Americans? Joe Biden is a has-been, a do-nothing, done-nothing Democrat who has no plan, no thought, and who will turn our nation into the hands of those who wish to burn our country and its freedoms to the ground. This is Eric Wright, and this has been the Closet Conservative Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to our podcast. Please remember to give a 5-star review and share our podcast with your friends. The Closet Conservative Podcast is a production of The Liberty Loft. Copyright The Liberty Loft, 2020. You can find more shows and information on our website, www.thelibertyloft.com, or any of our social media channels.